everyone, my name is Melissa. I am here to tell you guys about our story of Jason's accident. He was in an accident, and from that day until the day that he was discharged from his rehab facility, it was 100 days. So I'm here to tell you about our first 100 days of a new life. So I want to take you back to May 15th, 2019. At that time, I was working as an ICU nurse. I was working in a medical surgical ICU in a really busy level 1 trauma center at a hospital right outside of Washington, D.C. I had been a nurse for 5 years, and I was really used to critical care nursing and that type of high acuity. So that day, I remember it vividly. It was a Wednesday. It was the first really beautiful sunny day that spring. The weather was really starting to turn, and I was picking up a Cadillac that I had earned through my business. And so I was at the Cadillac dealership. Earlier that day, I had been training clients, and my boyfriend Jason had gone to the dealership to test drive my car and to make sure that I was going to love it, to finagle a deal. And so he had been there. He test drove the car. I was going to pick it up. So I was at the Cadillac dealership signing papers on my car, and I remember I was texting him and he wasn't answering, and I couldn't get in touch with him at all. And so little red flags were going off, but I was supposed to be going out of town the next day, and I was buying a car. So I was just there was a hustle bustle right before you go on a trip, And so I was focused on getting out of the dealership, getting home, trying to get ready for my trip the next day. So I remember that I had an influx of messages on my Instagram DM. And people were congratulating me, saying congrats on my car and everything like that. And as I was sitting in the dealership, how those things just extend longer and longer. I was sitting at the dealership and scrolling through Instagram messages, and I got one from Jason's sister. Her name is Sloan. He's been estranged from his family for 20 plus years. In the 9 years that he and I had been together, I had never met any of his family members. And so I got this message from Sloan, and she said, it was in my unread column in Instagram, and she said, can you please call my mom, and gave me her phone number. And so, at the time I was at the dealership, I didn't have a car charger, my phone was dying, and I was I'll call her when I get home. But something in me, my gut was there might be something up here. I called his best friend, and I was have you heard from Jason? And she said no. And I, squared away the deal at the car dealership, drove home, plugged my phone in to charge, and I called his mom. And so this was the first time that I had spoken to her. He and I had been together for 9 years. I had never met one of his family members, but I called her, and she said, are you with Jason? And I was no, I'm not. She's you're not still together with him. And I was yeah, we're together. I was trying, and my brain was trying to piece my brain was trying to piece it together. And I was yeah, we're still together, but I'm not physically with him right now. And she was oh my gosh, you haven't heard? And I'm I haven't heard what? And she said, Jason's been in a severe motorcycle accident. He's in critical condition in the ICU, and the doctors don't know if he's going to make it. And it was literally the words out of my most horrifying nightmare came crashing into reality. And I just remember it felt like my world ended, time stopped, and my heart was racing, but it also felt numb. You kind of just dissociate from your body, right? And so I was okay, what hospital is he at? And she said, I don't know what hospital he's at. All I have is a phone number. I'm like, okay, give me the phone number. So she gave it to me, and immediately I knew that it was my hospital. I could recognize the phone number. Turns out I did have a missed call from my hospital, but I hadn't seen it, and if I had, I honestly probably wouldn't have answered it because it was right, leading up into night shift, which is what I worked, and I would have assumed that they were asking me to work. So I called the phone number, and the social worker from the emergency room answered. I introduced myself. I told her, that my boyfriend was Jason. He was brought in as a motorcycle accident, and she said that she was in the ER when he was brought in, that he was awake, that he was talking, and that he had extensive injuries, extensive orthopedic injuries, and they had brought him to the trauma ICU. And so when she said that, I had a wave of relief rush over me, hearing her say, he's okay, he's awake, he's talking. But I also knew that his mom told me that the doctors said he may not make it through the night. And so I asked the social worker, I was like, are you sure you're talking about the right person? Because his mom is, driving up from Florida as we speak, thinking that her son may die today. And the social worker, she was like, well, let me read the notes, okay? So she pulls up his chart, and I can hear her on the phone. And she kind of goes quiet, and being in healthcare, I could sense her energy shift on the phone with me, and she kind of gasped, and time stood still, right? It's every second that goes by that she's silent on the phone, it feels like a literal eternity. And she said, okay, I could hear her trying to gently break news to me. And again, my body just felt paralyzed in fear, and paralyzed in just hanging, in limbo almost, right? And she said, it looks like that, according to his notes, it looks like he had decompensated once he got to the trauma ICU. He's now on life support. And I heard her pause and gasp a little bit deeper. And I could feel her trying to find her words, and she said, Melissa, I'm really sorry. I think that you really need to talk to the surgeon who's taking care of him. I'm trying to put into words what that feeling feels like, and it's pretty much impossible to verbalize what that feels like. Time, it stands still. Your world ends. It's so hard to grasp that this is reality. You can't undo it. You're not going to wake up from this nightmare. This is now, it's really happening, and you have to figure out how you're going to cope with it. And so, because I was a charge nurse, I had a lot of friends in the hospital. I was friends with other charge nurses of other ICUs, and so I knew the phone number to the spectral link of the charge nurse of the TICU, the trauma ICU. And so as I was gathering my things, trying to rush out the door, trying to get to the hospital as soon as I could, I called the trauma ICU charge nurse. And my friend Chris answered and said, TICU, this is Chris. And I was like, hey Chris, it's Mel from Med-Surg ICU. My boyfriend Jason, he was the code blue that was brought in tonight. And he said, holy shit, Mel, I just did 8 minutes of CPR on him. And I had been walking out of our front door, and I just felt my knees go weak, and I reached back to the wall behind me to try to stabilize myself, and I just my back just slid down the wall, and I just collapsed, because as an ICU nurse, I know what a code looks like. I know what it looks like when someone's heart stops beating, and it's intense, and it's delicate, and fragile, and this person's life is literally in limbo. And so for Jay to have been, he got 8 minutes of CPR, and they got, it's called ROSC, return of spontaneous circulation, so they got a pulse back. But just because they saved his life and got a pulse back, it didn't mean that he couldn't potentially have brain damage. Like, I don't know, what happened to his brain in that time that he was pulseless. Were they able to do like high quality chest compressions so that he didn't suffer any brain damage? He didn't have any point where his brain wasn't getting oxygen. And so I can't even tell you like that emotion of helplessness, overwhelming helplessness, and just unknown. Like, our lives changed in that instant, and it's pretty much impossible to grasp, right? And so you just start going through emotions. So I knew I needed to get to the hospital as fast as I could. So I got in my car. Mind you, this is a car that I had literally bought like hours before, so it's a brand new car. I remember feeling so disoriented. Like, nothing was normal. There was no comfort to be found, right? Everything felt like it's just very, very overwhelming. So I drove myself to the hospital. I don't really remember that at all. I do remember just feeling like dazed and being like, where do I park? I don't know. Like, I parked in our employee garage. I used my badge to get in. It felt very odd to be going to the hospital for something other than going to work, right? And so my mind and my body were just like trying to come to terms with this. And so I went in through our employee entrance. I walked through the basement of the hospital. I got myself to the trauma ICU. It's a locked unit. And so the staff had me sit in the family waiting room. And at this point, so I had called his best friend and told her that he had been in an accident. So she met me at the hospital. We walked in together, and we were sitting in the family waiting room, waiting for the surgeon to come out and tell us, the extent of his injuries and what had happened, and just fill us in and inform us of like what exactly were we looking at. And so again, like, time just literally drags. Every second that goes by is just drawn out emotional pain and numbness, and you feel like you're floating almost above, like, out of body, right? You just feel so dissociated and out of body. I remember just feeling like almost underwater when everything that you hear is muffled. That's what it was like, trying to like grasp what was occurring, right? And so the surgeon, the trauma surgeon, finally had a second to come out. And that's the thing with, hospitals and injuries and anything like that. You want the doctors to be taking care of your loved one. Like, as much as you want them to stop everything and come out and ease your pain and ease your questions and like give you answers and help you like feel some sort of peace or some sort of understanding through this, right? You're desperate to feel that. And so you want the surgeon to come talk to you, but they are in the room, hands on, saving your loved one's life. And so that waiting period it's devastating. It is terrifying, and it feels like it's endless. So she finally came in to get us, and we went to like a conference room. So she sat us down and kind of told us, first of all, like what they gathered had happened from people who were on the scene and witnessed the accident. And so the first thing that she said was that he was driving on a really busy highway in our area, like the busiest highway in our area. The onlookers, people said that he was, probably driving 60 to 70 miles an hour, which is pretty, the speed limit is 65. And it was rush hour, so if it was like a little bit slower, you know, reasonable, but it was probably, you know, between 60 to 70 miles an hour. And a car had changed lanes, and they changed lanes right in front of him, and were going obviously a slower speed, and so he basically hit the back of the car, and his body was propelled over the roof, and his body landed 300 feet from his motorcycle. And so, like, trying to wrap your mind around your man's physical body, like being thrown through the air and landing with, you know, such high velocity and impact on a busy highway, like it's a devastating, horrifying thought, right? And there's so many ways that he could have died right there on impact. You know, he could have snapped his neck and died. If he landed 1 millimeter differently, he could have died immediately. And the surgeon went on to tell us about his injuries. And so at this point, I feel like when I got the phone call from his mom and talked to the trauma nurse, Chris, and kind of like grasped how serious this was. You know, this wasn't just like, it wasn't a minor accident. Like, this was major. This was life-changing. Like, in an instant, our lives changed forever. And girlfriend Mel was grasping that. And I feel like as soon as I got to the hospital, I kind of like switched to Nurse Mel. And it was, I feel like, a safety mechanism for me, because like girlfriend Mel couldn't feel how scary and how helpless she was in this situation, but like Nurse Mel has a lot of knowledge, has a lot of experience in critical care nursing, and I feel like my only way of grasping or like feeling like I had any sort of hope was to just channel my nursing instincts, my nursing brain. So as she was telling us his injuries, I just was like full on nursing, head to toe assessment, like everything that we're trained on, right? And so he had broken his most significant injury, his most life-threatening injury was what's called an open book fracture of his pelvis. And so he had basically cracked his pelvis in half, except there were 3 places where his pelvis literally shattered. And so this is an injury that is, there's a 50% mortality rate because, you know, around your pelvis there are major blood vessels, major arteries, and over, you know, 50% of people with this injury end up bleeding out internally because there's just so much blood that comes from this area, right? And so she told us that stat, and she told us he had broken both ankles severely, you know, like open fractures, bones sticking out of his ankles, several bones in both of his feet. He had broken they knew he had broken his right wrist at the time, a really severe break in his radius. Turns out 2 weeks later, they found out that he also broke his left wrist. He had dislocated his right elbow and his shoulder, and broken several ribs on both sides. He had also ruptured his bladder. And so as she was telling us this, I was trying to get like a mental image, right? Like I wanted to know what to expect when I walked into his room. Because ICU rooms, they're overwhelming. Patients on life support, it's a lot. It's a lot of things like foreign objects sticking out of your loved one's body, right? And so she told us that he did come to the hospital alert and talking, and in the ER they knew that he had extensive orthopedic injuries. They knew that he was bleeding internally. because his vital signs were so unstable. But at that point, he was still awake. So she's informing us of all of this, right? And so as they brought him up to the trauma ICU to stabilize him, so he was on pressors, which is a life-saving medication that keeps your blood pressure up. Since he was bleeding out, he was losing so much volume, so they initiated what's called a massive blood transfusion. So a special protocol. As a nurse, it's the scariest protocol to run, in my opinion. Especially when someone is bleeding out so rapidly. It's all hands on deck to infuse blood products so that that person doesn't code. It is such a critical time. And so he had received 23 units of blood products that first night. So basically, like, his full volume of blood was replaced at least 3 times. He had endless liters of fluid. You know, trauma protocol is just, you have to, like, fluid resuscitation, right? And so he had gotten, 23 units of blood products. I don't even know how many liters of fluid. He was on pressors to keep his blood pressure up. And so when they got him to the ICU, they're doing all these things, right? And so they want to set his elbow. And at this point, he was getting agitated, obviously, like, he's in pain. He's, not even with it. He doesn't remember this part at all. But to make him more comfortable, they gave him a medication called ketamine. And ketamine it's a great medication. It's essentially like a horse tranquilizer, but it helps the person feel good, right? Well, it turns out that Jason has a really severe, like, anaphylactic or allergy to ketamine. So as soon as they gave him the ketamine, he went into respiratory arrest. His throat completely closed and his heart stopped. And his throat was so swollen shut. So usually the trauma team will code the patient and get the airway in. His throat was so closed that the trauma surgeons, the specialists, they could not pass a tube through to secure the airway. They had to call anesthesia. So I'm hearing this and knowing, like, how scary those situations are. Like, this person's life is literally in limbo and you're waiting for anesthesia to get to the bedside to hopefully be able to get an airway so that you can save them, right? And so anesthesia was able to get an airway forcefully. They placed bilateral chest tubes because they thought, maybe he's coding because he had a pneumo. They didn't necessarily, at that point, they didn't know it was the ketamine that caused him to code. Countless things can cause a person to code, right? And so they were just doing everything they could to save him, luckily. And so my friend Chris, he did all 8 minutes of CPR. And if you, learn about life-saving medicine, the protocol is usually a person does 2 minutes of CPR, you check for a pulse, and then somebody else comes. Because it's physical, right? You can really only do so long high-quality chest compressions. But I talked to Chris afterwards, and he was like, Mel, I was just, like, jumping on this guy's chest, like, pounding on his chest, because he was young, he was fit, he was able, he deserved a chance, like, every chance that he could get. He's like, you couldn't peel me off of him. Like, I just felt so called to keep doing everything I could to save his life. And so, EMS saved him, Chris saved him, the trauma team, like, his life was saved in so many ways. Like, this experience, like, that incident was obviously by far, by any stretch of the imagination, the worst thing that had happened to either of us in our lifetime. But at the same time, you couldn't ignore the fact that it seemed like there was so much divine intervention that saved him, that got him through even that first day. Like, there were so many ways that he could have died that first day. He could have bled out at the scene. He could have been paralyzed. He could have died instantly on impact, and he didn't. And I'm just so grateful that everything happened the way that it did. There's just, like, so much from so many people that went into saving his life that day. And so I'm getting this mental image in my head of all the things that are going to be hooked up to him, right? And I'm trying to brace myself for what it's going to be like to walk into this room, you know, a room that I have been to before, a unit that I'm familiar with. What is it going to be like to walk in there and see the man that I love, like, fighting for his life? The friend that we were with, like, she was not medical. She did not have experience with this type of stuff. And so I know that as I was trying to get my mental picture in my head of what it's going to look like and feel like, I was trying to explain everything that I could in taking what the surgeon was telling us medically and trying to explain it in a way that felt, I don't know, trying to ease some shock, some pain, some horror, right? And so finally, when the surgeon said that we could go back and see him, I remember this just like so vividly. And so they have to like buzz you in, and so the doors like automatically open. And it was night at this point. It was like 9 or 10 o'clock, and so the unit was dark, and it was a long, straight hallway, and his room was the very last one in the corner at the end. And so I just remember like holding her hand, and we're walking through this long, dark hallway, and it felt like almost like walking on like death row. It was just like trying to like brace ourselves for like entering this new existence almost. And so we walk into his room, and I'll tell you like all the things that he was hooked up to. So it was dark in the room, and outside the only thing that was lighting the room up were all the monitors with his vital signs on them. So he had an EEG, so like stuff to monitor his brain activity. He had an EEG on his head. He had the breathing tube in his mouth. He had like an oral tube, and so a breathing tube and a tube that went down into his stomach. Both of those were coming out of his mouth. He had his right wrist was in a cast, both